Good evening, class. How is everybody? I'm going to touch upon a controversial subject that, if you are in the internet sphere or know about so-called public intellects of the early 21st century, there is a philosopher by the name of Dr. Gregory Robert Johnson. It's very controversial because in his early years he was a libertarian that turned to white nationalism. So I'm about to assume what Dr. Gregory R. Johnson's early politics was about and his mysterious sexuality that many of his critics pry upon him about. I've been curious about this myself as it could underline certain behavior patterns in his work, and once we understand the author, we can understand the work that follows. But for now, I'm kind of using a deconstruction approach. As ironic as that sounds, it is required to understand where all of this is coming from and what it implies. So if you don't know, Dr. Gregory Robert, the R is for Robert Johnson, was probably born in 1971. He is adopted, as he said in a podcast before. And during the late 90s and early 2000s, we can guess his age was between 28 to 31 when he got his doctorate. I'm thinking he got it when he was 30. What's more interesting is his doctoral advisor, Richard Belkley. Belkley is a metaphysics and Kant professor who teaches at Tulane in New Orleans. But he advised and directed Johnson for his thesis on Kant on Swedenborg. And the book, or I wouldn't say book, it's you can look at the entire doctorate at Catholic American University or Scribe and download the file, but it kind of became the basis of a book which Johnson himself also translated Kant's interest in Swedenborg. So it is a very interesting read, and it's associated with Johnson's early upbringing as a Catholic or into Christianity. Importantly, Johnson, after getting his doctorate, would appear in random journals. I wouldn't just say random out of nowhere, but journals from about paternalism, moralism, and Ayn Rand. And a good amount of his information, who didn't know who he was, starting in 2001, 2002, Gregory R. Johnson is a philosopher in private practice in Atlanta. In addition to consulting with individuals and institutions, he runs the Invincible College, a private adult education organization that teaches courses on topics in philosophy, psychology, and literature. He is the author of articles on such thinkers as Aristotle, Rousseau, Kant, Swedenborg, Heidegger, Gadamer, Hayek, Ismail Birlen, and Ayn Rand, as well as topics in moral and political philosophy. He can be reached at, the most important part, Gregory R Johnson at mindspring.com, which, by the way, remnants of this email is left and archived from articles almost 2 decades ago. This little excerpt is in a book about the moral of the story and contributions about paternalism in literature. And there is an academic article of Johnson talking about Jane Austen and paternalism. Johnson's interest in women, I believe, is a reoccurring theme in his early work. And this kind of mother state is especially not only, I would say, pondering to neoliberal types, but as well as Johnson's interest in the feminine and his respect towards women. However, during the week of September 11th, we know that Johnson became radicalized between the mid to late 90s to early 2000s, And in September 11th was at a quote-unquote hate dinner, probably in the interests of Dr. William L. Pierce's club. But many of the Mindspring email you can find on Objectivist Living forums, and as well We the Living at Objectivism. Johnson was very much an advocate of this early libertarian thought about this kind of voluntary society. But he was trying to convince fellow Ayn Rand people and libertarians about the 9/11 attack, and saying that their logic is flawed unless we point them out that they're Jews and that they don't belong in the thinking of intellectual libertarianism, like a game. But I thought this was a very interesting passage because he writes this. He writes, "Are Arab countries anti-capitalist? So is Israel." As if he's not saying Israel is bad per se, but he's saying that the libertarians are mad because of anti-capitalism. And Johnson is saying that Israel is entirely anti-capitalist. And what that means is that Johnson is not making the argument of race realism to the libertarians. He's saying that, he is a libertarian pro-capitalist with kind of this race realist type of behavior. And as said before, with his interest in Jane Austen, he's also kind of this classic feminist. At this time, his age was probably 31, if he's born in 71. In the same October that year, on Objectivist Living, the forums, Johnson again is trying to persuade these libertarian types to think into the factor that our own enlightenment and logic is actually genetic. Here, the ability to act rationally, one's volitional powers will vary with one's rational powers. If this is true, then it is not the case that racists, interesting, deny violation altogether, but instead recognize that our ability to determine our actions by non-genetic factors itself may be determined by genetic factors. So Johnson is really pointing out this fact that genes are controlling me, the way I'm presenting this speech or my habits and whatnot. And he says, genes, IQ, racial differences all add up to the elements in the corner of Ayn Rand's living room. Ignoring it won't make it go away. Greg. So I think at this time, Johnson was going for a more race realist, but Charles Murray, politically correct academic view. But at the same time, he was being fascinated with far-right interest in his late 20s. I believe he started to get in Deaf in June or Dead Can Dance around the same time he was in PhD studies. So what becomes this kind of fascination with early European art becomes this kind of punk rock into, listen, I'm trying to be more professional. We have to be Charles Murray race realism. Now, I don't want to jump into the whole subcultural thing, and I'll get to that later. But let me point this out with some of his more blunt points of views from that same post. This one says, as for the questions of inheritability of IQ, the best discussion of this and other issues is to be found in Arthur Jensen's book, The G Factor. His case is crushingly well documented and well argued, and to my mind, totally convincing. And to my mind, he says. And so you see this early kind of Jared Taylor, Philippe Rushton exposure to American Renaissance ordeal that understanding societies requires understanding IQs. But again, this kind of goes a little more different when he says this. He says, one can grant the principle of heredity and the innate differences among races and still treat people as individuals, not as members of a group. There is a limit to this, however. After all, there are billions of people on this planet, and life is too short to deal with each other as an individual. Isn't that ironic? It would, however, be altruistic to ignore group differences and group behavior patterns, since they have high predictive power, even though treating people as members of a group may be unjust to individuals in a given group, unjust to others, he writes in caps, but eminently rational to oneself, given the limit of time and knowledge. And here's a little story that Johnson writes. A young woman is walking down a lonely street at midnight. Ahead she sees a black man. On the other side of the street is an Oriental man. Note how he doesn't say Asian. Does she cross the street? I would say, yes, cross the street, and don't give it a second thought. The odds are with her. And this would outline later to Johnson's later work a decade later, In Defense of Prejudice. A college basketball recruiter can visit one high school in Dotville. Does he go to the predominantly black high school or the predominantly Mexican one? And according to Johnson's libertarian logic, I guess you go to the Mexican one. And so Johnson has this kind of anger towards blacks, probably because he was working at Morehouse in the late 90s during that time. And in his mid to late 20s, he was being fed this whole anti-white narrative he couldn't embrace anymore, and kind of snapped. So, and this one's a very interesting one where Johnson's going to refer to blacks as animals. So he writes, on the plane back from Munich, they played Dr. Dolittle too. At a certain point, I found myself in the odd position of finding it more plausible that animals could talk than Eddie Murphy could be a doctor. I wondered why I had this reaction. After all, there are black doctors. My conclusion was this. Hollywood does not want me to believe that animals can talk, but they definitely want me to believe that Eddie Murphy can be a doctor. Hence the steady stream of black computer geniuses, scientists, judges, brain surgeons. So, do they expect to swell the ranks of objectivism in blacks? And so, this word, animal, and he's equating blacks with animals. I'm going to get in that in a bit, and about kind of Johnson's very strange paternal politics with regards to himself being a part of this Eurocentric kind of racist worldview versus the animal underling. And recently, R.G. Fowler is another pen name for Greg Johnson, or Robert Gregory Fowler. Robert Gregory Fowler, or Greg Johnson, was also head of SavitridAV.org, where Johnson, when he turned 29, 30, had a deep interest in Savitri Davy. And there is an interview he did with this kind of black metal transgressive woman. And by the way, R.G. Fowler is confirmed as Greg Johnson in the BBC podcast about Savitri Davy. And they went up to Greg Johnson and confirmed it over the podcast. But a little digression from the animal part, we're going to get into subculture here. So, in this same interview, the interviewer asked, on this metal magazine of some sorts, whatever, how did you first hear of Savitri Davy, and what was your first impression of her? Johnson: my first impression was that Savitri Davy was one of history's great eccentrics. I am fascinated with human eccentricity, and that is what first led me to read her works. History is often stranger and more entertaining than fiction. Who could have made up Savitri Davy? She was utterly unique. So not only Savitri Davy is a woman, but she's also an eccentric. And accordingly, in Queer Culture, a Transgressive Tradition by Francis Nally, this means that the eccentric is a part of the transgressive queer liberal elite. It doesn't mean queer as in gay per se, but more into eccentric culture that has been put down to the ground and things like that. And so Johnson, as he was 30 and in his early time, wanted to be more of a professor or philosopher that was an eccentric, and that kind of led him more to break the rules, to say. R.G. Fowler, or Greg Johnson, will speak in the meta about himself in this same interview. He says, Dr. Greg Johnson, who was doing research for a new biography of Savitri Davy, discovered that the story is a lie. So in a weird way, Johnson is also putting himself there to say my readers should now read Dr. Greg Johnson's work because he's the professional here. In that same interview, I found some other funny stuff where Johnson says, I too love nature, and I love animals. I love my dog especially. I believe Johnson had a beagle of some sort, but I don't know if the dog's still alive, but Johnson loves walking that dog. I don't know if it's alive 20 years ago, but interesting part. We're getting back to the animals in Eddie Murphy. So here, I go to great lengths, however, to avoid supporting factory farms and other sickening forms of cruelty to animals. There is nothing natural about it. They are spawned from perversions of the human mind and soul, the marriage of greed and scientific method, to the exclusion of moral and aesthetic sensibilities. But again, a McDonald's meat farm in Florida has nothing to do with the interest of making profit at the sake of killing animals. It's more like this bizarre paternal distortion of character, what Johnson is saying. It's kind of distorted center of Catholicism. But anyway, he goes on to say, I go to great lengths not to harm plants as well. Interesting. I don't know why he's a Janus now, but I can't bear to weed my own garden. But the principle is the same for plants and animals. I eat some of them, but I also wish to do them the least possible harm. You could see how sensitive and vegetarian and vegan Johnson is. Of course, I can feel more sympathy for animals than plants, because they are more like me. Eurocentricity, the arrogance of white nationalism, incest utopia, assuming that you create an ethnostate because everyone's your brother and sister, homo nationalism. Okay, but especially cute animals. But I have no problem killing repulsive and dangerous animals. I had to underline that. And what do we say about Eddie Murphy? He's okay. He's this paternal snob that sees that people should be sent to the gas chamber or something, and he's unapologetic about it. And he wants to resurrect this kind of LARPy reactionary roleplay of Philosophy 101. Anyway, he has a rejecting, angry teacher dark side to him, according to this right here. But he is interested in being this Boyd Rice, Jim Goad, transgressive brethren power electronics act that he was kind of delving, but in this kind of weak Mishima type of incel way. But anyway, he also wrote under a different pen name for Vanguard's News Network by the Cat Lady, and he wrote a book on the Black Sun by Gregory Clark, which is a great book, but he had a negative review about it. And at the very end of this article, he writes, in the end, I am a ruthless pragmatist. I wish there were a lot fewer nutty Nazis, but as long as they are around, I have no objection to Gregory Clark or Jocelyn Godwin making it a few bucks retailing their ideals. Interesting, again, with the capitalist profit, especially if it benefits our cause along the way. By the Cat Lady. I remember once asking in a first account Greg Johnson at a Philadelphia countercurrents meeting in person about David Bowie's interest in neo-Nazism, and he says, it's this good metapolitical culture kampf cause. It doesn't matter as long as it works under the market. So again, this is a very interesting little passage because it's about how everything seems to be this strange objectivist thinking about the character. So there's definitely ideological leadings to Johnson made in his 30s or late 20s that had something to do with this kind of pseudo-Christianism. Now, more Robert letters, more of this R.G. Fowler type of ordeal. If you go to savitridevi.org, there is a letters exchange, and we have letters from 2007 and 2006. And I'll point out more of Johnson's arrogance, or Robert's arrogance, if his parents ever called him by that name. First of all, if the accusation of race mixing is offered as an argument for dismissing Savitri Devi's ideals and avoiding her books, then it is a very bad argument because even people who make bad decisions or suffer from character flaws might still have interesting and true things to say. And no matter how much one might deplore subracial mixing, it is clearly not as bad as race mixing. So, again, for the second quote, Johnson is indeed a white nationalist because his subracial mixing, while he thinks it's minorly bad, he still is an advocate for it because he thinks that everybody just wants truth, justice, and a night white, suburban, civic nationalist voting Donald Trump kind of country. Even though he might say he's against civic nationalism, he still wants this kind of pluralistic, everybody's white, and I want to be left aloneism that he kind of gets out of this thing. But again, if a white mixes with a black or Asian, somehow they are the enemy of state to him. And again, this is ironic because he talks about flaws and interesting things to say, but what if that person race mixes? I don't know. What about pilleater? What if pilleater race mixes? I don't know where he's coming from this. But in that same letter, some of his asexuality is exposed. And Savitri and her husband thought that the sole purpose of sex is procreation. Theirs was a completely celibate marriage. Savitri claimed as late as 1968 that she had never in her life had sexual intercourse, and there is no reason to think that she ever did. Is Johnson congratulating Savitri for being an asexual? That a woman can somehow go across her life and not have sex or something like that, and that's why, this polyglot that speaks all this language and into math is somehow celebrated by him? And this might be another interest of this asexual feminist hero to Johnson, that you can be all that and for this liberal, transgressive queer elite new order. But this is where some of Johnson's celebration of the asexual is coming in. I now want to go over a recent article or a recent interview in 2017 where he did an interview for the New York Magazine. But we can get across some of his platonism here, and this is just for the public, and all this information is public, by the way. So, there is this kind of erotic platonism here. So, quote, "There have always been such people in our movement at all levels, from simple supporters and donors to organizers and activists. Martin Webster, for instance, was one of the central organizers and activists in the UK for decades, and he's gay. Although we have not done any empirical studies yet, based on more than 16 years of involvement in the white nationalist movement," meaning he started when Johnson was 29, "I would say that our movement is far less gay than the Republicans." Now, here's the interesting part. Many people accuse Johnson of being gay, but at the end of the statement, he says that being gay or trans is somehow bad because Johnson could be outed as a self-hating gay or sees the whole gay identity as a bad thing and doesn't see it as this paternal thing of asexual platonism. And I call it erotic platonism. And here's another quote, "In the society I envision, we would restore some of the restraints on sex, not because it's dirty, but because it's sacred. Sex is sacred. Very important thing for Johnson. Feminism, pickup artists, pornography, and I suppose this very discussion would not exist. But there would be statues of gorgeous naked nymphs and athletes in every public square. There would be stigmas on promiscuity and extramarital sex. Marriage bonds would be stronger. Divorce would be rare and difficult." Now, those are all good things, but Johnson is coming from this radical asexual platonism where, okay, if you can't be gay, I'm going to insult you for being gay. And by the way, Johnson also insulted me for being gay, which is totally not true. I think self-hating gays people do that. But there would be statues of gorgeous naked nymphs, and that somehow stimulates someone's sexuality, of the beauty of the body. And again, he's lost in this kind of autistic, libertarian, paternal, highly influenced by Christianity type of talk. And this, you can see why Johnson's a pagan, because his parents were Christians, he went to Christian school, and he doesn't like it anymore. In that same interview, there is this kind of queer culture elitism. The consequence of these policies would be that more people would have more access to better quality sex with the context of long-term relationships. Better people would have better children, and the human race would be nudged back on the upward evolutionary path. That is to say, Johnson not only believes in eugenics and this kind of Aryan master race, which is kind of like a quintessential thing to Johnson, and thinking it's kind of this far-right, I could say it's Promethean transhumanism, I'm not so sure. but better quality sex with the context of long-term relationships. In other words, that good sex is something you do as an innocent virgin, which is kind of this Christian value, but he's saying it's pagan. And so I think he's all over the place for this. I don't know what he's really saying, but again, he's mentioning it. Just like how Juan Johnson on Andy Worski mentioned he loves pornography, but what kind of pornography? Johnson loves pornography, but I don't know what kind of pornography he likes. That's what we're interested in here. I said that white nationalism should be straight but not narrow, meaning that we should uphold heterosexuality as the norm and yet not go bent out of shape about the fact that some people inevitably do not fit the norm. So, white nationalism is queer culture elitism, from James J. Amira to Margot Metroland. That it's this Boyd Rice type of strange, liberal, eccentric culture that if you fall into gay identity, you all lose. But if you're all like straight, okay, that's fine, but we're like liberals and we respect our gay identity. So again, I don't know where Johnson's coming from this, but he's basically justifying his queer culture elitism. And by the way, if you attend Countercurrents meetings, Johnson himself says, whatever happens here is off the record, meaning you can't tell if something happens there. So how do I know you're not dealing illegal drugs there? But anyway. In his latest Ask Me Anything question podcast on Countercurrents, Johnson suspiciously writes about he's trying to talk about problems with pair bonding. He talks about staying in the movement. He also talks about guidance for young men. And it's totally not gay. He's just a gay paternal figure trying to help you get together in this kind of religious type of way. And everybody can do their own thing. It's this fake, decentralized paternalism or something really weird, cult-like behavior. But then again, like Socrates when he guides Alcibiades, which you may call homo paternalism. This is for sure homo paternalism. Again, I think I want to mention one more article here and have another antidote. But Johnson also had an Against Pot article in 2017. And I'm going to read this. Years later, though, after I had my PhD and a teaching job, so he was 30. A friend came to visit me and asked me where he could get some pot. I said, there's a sign down by the record store that says drug-free zone. I bet you can buy some there. So we walked to the store. I went inside, bought a CD, and by the time I came out, he had scored some pot. We walked back to my place. Yeah, it's totally not hookup culture or anything like that, and I decided to try it, watching TV with him. Rumor. One of the rumors was that Joshua Buckley of Tyr, and, when he met Buckley in a bookstore, Buckley had strong arms. That's an audio podcast somewhere, but it's there. I just thought I would add a tip, but one more on the pot romance. I had sympathy tickets the next day, so he goes to see classical. So my friend and I partook some more pot, then had dinner at my favorite restaurant. It was the tastiest meal I ever had. Then we heard some classical guy and Richard Strauss musical autobiography with sections on his art, his romance and marriage, his battle with the critics, and his peaceful retirement from the world. It was the most profound musical experience I had ever had. I was completely inside the music. I lived, felt, and understood the meaning of every theme. I particularly got into the romance section, with its musical flirtation, bickering, and lovemaking. I wanted to do a whole ring cycle on drugs. So again, this goes to another video I did on the Brotherhood of Cocaine, that men have gay sexual urges when they're men have gay sexual urges when they are high or drunk. And this is a clear repressive homosexual urge I feel here, that I feel some eroticism that this virgin is doing drugs for the first time and having this kind of whirlwind of platonic romance with his boyfriend that will like take him home and have sex with him, and all his dreams are going to come true. Yeah, the against pot article is very strange because he never elaborates, and we're totally just friends, and we're asexuals, and we're autistic. But it also shows his outrageous bourgeois lifestyle and how now he lives in Budapest and takes your money to pay rent. But again, there's also some lost Discuss comments. And by doing search on Discuss, you might come across one of these, which I remember seeing, but I couldn't find it. But somebody was talking about sex and organs and whatever. And I know Johnson has said before that he loves his penis in the trans article, but he also said, quote, "Why would God make a reproduction organ also spew out urine?" That's right. He's saying that penis also spews out urine, and like, why would you do that because it's also urine? And so he's very negative about body parts, but he's okay about what he looks like. And I think maybe over the years, Johnson was like slowly discovering his sexuality or something. But again, my own first-hand account when I went to a countercurrents meeting, I asked Greg about Lassie Nielsen and gay films, and he said, no, let's not go there. So again, Johnson is hiding something. And whatever he had a horrible relationship with a girl, or had zero relationships at all, or he had a very spiteful incel, I'll show you all movement, I don't know. Maybe for a fact Johnson is like pampered to a point where, the funny part is that someone on Discord once told me, a girl from Finland told me that everyone knew Greg Johnson was gay at one of these meetings, but I don't know. So, the conclusion. I think of Greg Johnson more like Richard Simmons. Richard Simmons being this kind of eccentric 1950s flamboyant fit and structure. And everyone knew he was gay, but when accounted of being gay, Simmons never announced that he was gay. And we all just assumed he's gay, but he sued people and put lawsuits saying, don't ever say I'm gay. And this is what you would call a closet homosexual. And Greg Johnson, I think, is that closet homosexual, but he's moved from that. Again, Lassie Nielsen films, we know that Lassie Nielsen, the director, is into little boys, and it can get really creepy, like he's a pedophile. But many people love these films because it's about radical platonic asexualism. So Johnson might even be more as a radical asexual. My friend who writes for Countercurrents, and he doesn't write anymore, but I knew him in person, Doug Huntington, and he said, listen, I don't think Johnson's gay. I think, from knowing him, I think he's a radical asexual with more leaning towards nice, innocent guys, like some kind of Japanese yaoi. Right? Johnson wants to live out that Japanese yaoi lifestyle, but in the context of like this like subculture based upon guys who don't have sex, but they're more into like going and hugging in bed or kissing or holding each other's arms or things like that. But again, that makes me contradict that because Johnson said in a Worski podcast that he likes pornography, and that shows he does have a sexual drive. But what pornography? What pornography is he interested in? So I want to conclude there and about my own approximate deep research on Johnson's interest and how much of his sexuality does influence him as a white nationalist. That white nationalism is not only a protection of suburban middle-class culture for him, or the protection of the petite bourgeois class, but Johnson is less about Marxism and more about this kind of continuation of libertarian philosophy 101, pampered lifestyle being adopted, and he's now just this kind of, you want to say cat lady, where he's reminiscing on this kind of, he knows queer culture is real, but he just doesn't want to show it. And I think that is the assumption with Gregory R Johnson's early development that he kind of became more an adult into all this radical stuff. And yeah, it's kind of like having your high school teacher being interested in Boy Rice, but I guess we just have to deal with it for now. Class dismissed. Thanks for listening, everyone. Until next time.